About last week where he has played a little bit better. What a pass by Rondo.
That might be the Tiger.
Why not? Why can't I be the MVP of the league? Why can't I be the best player in the league?
The Lakers repeat back-to-back titles. The LA Lakers, the 2010 NBA champions.
And the Bulls with their recent spurt are now at 44% from the field, 17 for 39. What a move by Rose. Oh! Yes, and it counts over Joel Anthony.
Once again, Marv, Reggie getting very physical.
I noticed.
And I don't blame you, Reg, because this was...
What would you tell me if I told you that Derrick Rose actually deserved his MVP in the year 2011? Well, actually, I think I told you guys that 2 years ago. That was actually one of my favorite videos I've done on this channel, and it's already 2 years old, Christ. But it is no less true today than it was back then, and he is my next focus for NBA 2010s. Derrick Rose MVP season in 2011, there's a lot that can be said about it, especially in hindsight, because when we look back at it, we're mostly left with desire, I guess you would say, because now we're in 2019, he's just signed with the Detroit Pistons in free agency. It's one of those cheap 2-year deals, and man, that is just so tragic because he's only 30 years old. So just think about how much we missed. Because when a superstar turns 30, that's where you say, okay, well, he's turning a corner now, so he could still very well be in his prime. He could still be one of the best players in the league, but you understand that whatever contract he signs around that age, a team is getting themselves into a real commitment because they're going to have to deal with that player's decline probably once he gets around 34 or 35. But all throughout the 2010s, that's what we missed. He was so good that at the age of 22, he was able to win that MVP. He was able to win that MVP in a league that had a prime Dwight Howard, LeBron James, Kobe Bryant still, Kevin Durant when he's leading the league in scoring, or that's around the time where he starts. And he's able to come out of nowhere. That's what made his MVP so special. That's what, you know, people will look back at Derrick Rose and they'll say, well, he had one of the worst MVP seasons ever. That's what you say when you go back and look at the stats. That's what people say when they go back and look at the stats. But let me tell you, you know, in hindsight, Derrick Rose winning MVP at the age of 22, and that was only his third season in the league. That would feel like, it would feel like if D'Angelo Russell next season just became an MVP player, if he won an MVP. That's the best way I can equate it. And what I look for in criteria there is a player that is no doubt really good and definitely has potential, but you still say, yeah, you know, somewhere down the line he may be a superstar. Well, that's how we felt about Derrick Rose when he was younger, when he came into the 2009 playoffs, gave Boston everything they could handle as a rookie. You know he was good, but you did not look at that also and say he's going to be able to win MVP in a league with the other guys I just named in the next year or so. That was absolutely not, that's not what anybody thought except him. That's why it's one of my clips in the 2010 intro. That's why it's one of my favorite clips, that press conference. The press conference where he just says straight up, why can't I be the MVP of the league? Why not me? Why can't I be the best player? And when he said that, you were like, you know, cool, confidence, I guess, and then you moved on with your day. You went back to looking at the Celtics and Kobe and LeBron. You didn't pay that any mind. So that was some year, yet people will go back and say that was a really weak MVP year, and typically they'll look at something like him, I guess, averaging 25 points and 8 assists, but they'll look at it and say the rebounding numbers were really low, which it's supposed to be, it's a point guard, but I get it because point guards rarely ever win the MVP, historically anyways. But then they go to his percentages, his shooting splits, they'll say 44% overall, 33% from the three-point line. That's nothing special. And that right there is why, if you follow me, you notice I have an attitude when it comes to stats. I feel some type of way with people who just use stats for everything, because when they're used to try to paint the entire picture by itself, like they often are with Derrick Rose's MVP season, you lose how special it was for him to have been just one, you know, a regular upcoming player, an upcoming star, to go from that in 2010 and losing to Cleveland, because they played the Cleveland Cavaliers in the 2010 playoffs. And when that happened, nobody was looking at an upset or anything. They were like, oh cool, Derrick Rose and the Bulls, Finals, but this isn't going anywhere. The very next year, they were expected, well, at least through the performance they gave in the regular season, they were expected to maybe be in the NBA Finals. But it doesn't paint the picture of everything he dealt with that year being that young. The fact that he was playing with Kurt Thomas most of the season, a lot of the season, they gave that guy major minutes, he played in a lot of games. The fact that they had signed Carlos Boozer that year to be the second star, because back then, when Boozer was coming from his Utah days, Boozer was seen as a pretty high tier star. So he wasn't even there to start the season. He broke his hand doing something at home. I don't really remember exactly what it was, but a lot of key guys missed a lot of time that season. Yet in a conference that had the Miami Heat Big Three, the Celtics Big Three, and they had actually retooled that year, it just fell apart by the time they got to the playoffs with injuries, and the prime Dwight, they win 60 plus games and they get the first seed. That was also Rose's healthiest year by far. He played 81 games, about 37 minutes per game. And I'm talking about 37 minutes the hard way, like 37 minutes where he's got to be the best player on the floor or the Bulls aren't winning that night. If you look at his totals, he had 2,000 plus points and 600 plus assists. I'll say from actually having watched that season, visually it was one of the most impressive I'd ever seen. And that's what I'm most upset about that we lost throughout the 2010s, is a player who was very unique. Because we can see stat sheet stuffers, right? Guys who can put up crazy stats and all this stuff, but it was the way he played, and nobody quite plays like Derrick Rose. The comparison that would often come up throughout the 2010s while he was absent would be Russell Westbrook, obviously. If you're looking at things in terms of athleticism, explosion, speed, all that good stuff, then of course Russell is, of course, that's the no-brainer. But Rose had like a real precision to his game. You know, Westbrook, he can be kind of reckless sometimes when he's headed to the rim, reckless shot selection, things of that nature. I think what was so crazy about watching Derrick Rose is that he could be going 1,000 miles per hour in 2011. He could be going to the rim in what looked like a very reckless and fast manner, and then he could slow it down at the rim and finish with precision that very few guys had. And so many examples come to my head just from that one season. Around the time he was healthy, because some of the stuff came in the lockout year when he was playing as well. Like the layup against LeBron James and Dwayne Wade, I'm pretty sure that was actually in 2012. Like, it's difficult enough to avoid a block from LeBron James, but he also had Dwayne Wade, and he had to find a way. He had to find one space for the ball to be able to go, and he had to contort his body a certain way to get it to go exactly where it needed to be, and he did that. Same thing he did in Boston that year. When he drove into like 2 or 3 bodies, he was able, that's what I'm trying to get at here when I talk about him versus Westbrook, is that there was certain ways he could contort and angle his body in midair, and it's like nothing to this day still that we've ever seen. It's how precise he was with it. So it was an incredible season, and that's what you're most excited about with young players. So with him specifically, it was him winning the MVP at such a young age. And you're so excited when that happens because as a basketball fan, you're like, man, I got like 10 plus years of this guy. And that's what's most upsetting, because that really was probably the last full season of Derrick Rose as we knew him that we were able to get. And you just think about how much that changed, because in the year 2011, it was pretty clear that the Bulls just were not a good enough team to beat Miami. I've been looking for footage forever to be able to actually break down how they defended him that year. And I'm talking about the Miami Heat specifically in the conference finals, but between LeBron and Dwayne Wade on the perimeter, then having an option in Bosh, it was very clear that Rose, he didn't just need like a good team around him, like a solid team. That model was outdated. The one star and solid team thing, that was outdated. He needed another like real star. And that's what I hate we didn't get to see, aside from just him by himself. Throughout the 2010s, whether it would have come by him playing in Chicago, it probably would have, because I doubt he ever would have left Chicago if he would have been healthy throughout the 2010s. Just finding another real star player to go with him could have changed the Eastern Conference. Could have changed the East, because if you watch my evolution of the Eastern Conference video, then you saw the things that happened. You saw how many of the star players went out and how that kind of cleared the path for LeBron and whatever team he was on. And after 2011, even though it was only a 5-game series, it was really close to going 6, and you were probably excited to see that duel. That's one of the duels you were excited to see with LeBron in the East that just never materialized. So at the end of the day, as it pertains to his MVP specifically, you know, MVPs are disputed every single year. They are disputed this year. When Giannis won it, people said Harden should have got it. In 2016, the unanimous MVP, somehow people watched that year with Steph Curry and said there should have been somebody else. Maybe LeBron should have got it. And now here we are today, and as soon as 2011 comes up, people will say should have been LeBron. And that whole thing could have a 2010s video of its own. Maybe not, because that goes back to the 2000s and everything. But it often just becomes an argument of semantics. because people seem to get very unclear about what we're actually talking about when you say value. Because the way people want to define it is they'll say, you know, literally value this player and his value to this team. And that argument, that approach, it never really made sense to me, just because I felt like there was so many stars, so many superstars on a certain team where you could make the argument and say, if I took him away from that team, he's very valuable to them, so now they're going to be garbage. And that's the argument that they normally use when there's a detractor from an MVP, but I take that back to 2011 and Derrick Rose and say, okay, how do you go about arguing that LeBron James was more valuable to a Heat team that had a Dwayne Wade that was still playing at an MVP level and a prime Chris Bosh? How do you argue that LeBron was more valuable to that team than D Rose was to a Bulls team that was constantly dealing with injuries? Because what if Rose would have got hurt that year and you're still missing like Boozer and Noah misses time and Kurt Thomas is playing major minutes? Like, who's gonna lead that team then? Who is Ronnie Brewer gonna be the leader of the team? Like, who was gonna do it without Rose in 2011? Because in that specific year, 2011, where Dwayne Wade still could have been Finals MVP, something happened to LeBron. Obviously, they're probably not a Finals team anymore because the supporting cast isn't that good. But a prime D Wade and Chris Bosh can still get something done. The Bulls can't without MVP Derrick Rose. Not in that fashion when everybody was getting hurt. Of course, 2012 came around and he missed a bunch of games and the Bulls were still good, but that was a different year. They got a couple of different players, and again, there was more health. 2011, Derrick Rose's value from either perspective, right? The one where people detract and actually try to use semantics and say value, or if you're voting the other way, I think it was probably Derrick Rose both ways. So he got his MVP, youngest MVP ever, and then the 2010s, you know, I think we're really going to remember it as, and we're going to remember Rose as the tragic story of the 2010s because it changed so much. Not having an MVP level player for this last, you know, basically since 2011, because 2012 he was hurt a lot. So not having him this entire time, not being able to follow that story of if he was going to be able to bring a championship to Chicago, it really makes you appreciate guys that we have today, and it makes you appreciate D Rose too. And the barbershop talk that I just did yesterday for free agency was talking about how he signed with the Pistons and how at this point I'm just happy he's still in the league, man. After the amount of injuries he had, I think any like mortal, any real human being probably would have quit by now. And he somehow showed last season that he still had enough basketball in him to really help a contending team if he would have decided to. I'm a little bit disappointed it was the Pistons for that reason, but glad he's still around. And name a player who had more problems in him that still left their mark on this decade, or left a mark as big as that on this decade, because from the MVP in 2011 that'll always be talked about to his 50-point performance last season, that is still one of the most beautiful moments. That's always going to be one of the most beautiful moments in NBA history. It was just a flash, just a tiny flash of the things we'd missed over these last, not 10 years yet, about 7 or 8 years. It was just a flash, just a taste. And it makes you wonder, as he is only 30 years old going into the 2020s, like, man, what are we missing this decade as well? All the way back in 2011, he had already become one of the best players in the entire league. And now he's still only 30 as we're going into 2020. And so that's a good 3 or 4 more years of this upcoming decade that he could have affected. You just gotta appreciate these guys, man, because as crazy as Derrick Rose's work ethic was and his mentality was, he's just walking proof that there are some things that are just out of these guys' control.